recording. I can't really see, but I guess I'll have to just assume that's working. Okay, so here's our lecture notes. Hopefully everybody can see that. And I'm gonna go over to slides view. And so this is our introduction to game design, to video game design. And so as I mentioned, I'm just gonna be introducing some different terms that we'll be using throughout the semester. We wanna kind of define these terms. So a lot of these terms are pretty simple. You've probably heard them before. You may have like thought about them before. But we would just want to make sure that we, have the same shared vocabulary as we start to talk about how games work and building our own games. So that's the main goal of this lecture. There's a bunch of different stuff in here. We can see kind of our menu right here. We're going to talk about all these different topics. So there's a bunch of things that we're going to talk about. If you have any questions or you have like an example of something that you want to offer or something like that during the lecture, feel free to talk about anything that you noticed or questions that you have. You can also use the chat. I'll keep an eye on the MMP 270 chat to see if there's questions in there as I'm going. And feel free to interrupt me at any point if you have questions or anything like that. So let's get started. So you guys probably all recognize this, although it definitely was popular most likely long before you were playing video games. But this is the first Nintendo controller, and it's a good place to start just because it kind of shows us something that's specific about game design, which is that we have control over the game. So it's a good sort of like obvious representation of what makes game design and video game design different from other media like film or TV or comics or other things like that. And that big difference is that we have control over the game. So the game doesn't progress unless we, move our character or advance the narrative or do other things. So the controller also communicates a lot of things to us. Like this controller is very simple, but it communicates a couple things, right? We have like the movement pad, which shows us that we can move. It has arrows pointing in all four directions. So we know that we can move our character around the screen. And then we have two buttons basically. So we know that there's two things that we can do. And so it's pretty simple. When we start the game, we're going to move around and then we're going to hit the buttons and see what happens. And so it's a very simple representation of what makes games different from media that, came before them. And so interactivity is the principal element that defines games as a medium. There's a lot of different types of games, different genres and things like that. And we'll kind of look at all of those throughout the semester. But the main thing that makes a game and not something else is that it's interactive. And so here is a very rough drawing of the game feedback loop. And so you can see in my game feedback loop, I've got my little eyes here, I've got my ear here, and then I've got my controller here. Then I have my screen and my game system. So we input information into the system using our controller, and then that changes states in the game, and that changes what is represented on the screen. And then we see that, or we hear it, or in some cases we might feel it if there's haptic feedback. And then that causes us to make changes to what our input is. So it's this constant feedback loop between the user and the system. So when we're talking about a system of interaction in a video game, there's some ideals or some things that we want to try to achieve. So the first one of those is exploration. So we want our user to explore and understand the interface. So as we just looked at a second ago with our game controller, this gives us a lot of things to explore just within this one really simple format. It shows us, as I mentioned, that we can move, and it has these big red buttons that kind of say like, click these buttons and see what happens. So a game system should encourage exploration and understanding of the interface. So the way that we input information into the game. It also encourages discovery and exploration within the game world itself. So when we put input into the game, we see our character move around, And, you know, if our character was just on a blank white canvas, it might not be that interesting, but usually a game has some setting or some scenery or some elements that encourage us to say, okay, what's beyond this door, or what's on the other side of this, you know, part of the screen. So a game system also needs to allow the user to master the tools of the game. So we'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about level design and things like that, but a good game should teach the user how to play the game. So we can't assume that the user is any type of gamer, like an expert or a novice. We have to teach any type of user how to master the game. So a few examples of input. Obviously, we have the keyboard, we have the mouse, and we have the gamepad. We might have other things like voice or sound, like you could control some games with your voice or noises. 3D sensing input, like a Kinect or the Nintendo Wii. Arcade guns or light sensing. There's other types of sensors, haptic sensors. You might have, you know, like big haptic sensors, like in Dance Dance Revolution, in those arcades where you can actually jump on the buttons. There's a little bit of difference between these, but we'll kind of talk about that as we build our games. So with the keyboard, and similar to the gamepad, there's on-off input, essentially. You have a button that's either on or off. With the mouse, or if we had, I don't have a representation of like an analog stick on here. I should probably add that. But with the mouse, we have a different thing. We have buttons that are either on and off. We also have like a scale of where the mouse is or how fast it's moving. We'll talk a little bit about that when we do input for our game. So output, video, audio, and haptic feedback. So these are the components of the system. All of this stuff is, you know, pretty obvious. I'm sure this isn't really super, you know, new to you guys, but just to kind of define the terms that we're going to be using throughout the semester. So a game uses feedback to communicate information to the player about the state of the game. And there's a lot of different states in games. You know, there's the level that you're on, there's the character that you're playing, there's sort of the time that you've been playing, the number of points you have, the number of lives you have left. There's all these different types of information that the game keeps track of as you're playing it. And these are referred to as game states. And so on the processor side, the game controller is keeping track of all those states as you're playing, but it's also giving you information about when those states are changing. So if you run into a wall, your character stops moving. So that's a change in state that the player needs to be aware of to understand how to continue playing the game. So as I mentioned, the level, the score, other metrics that we want to keep track of, information about other players in the game world. So if you're playing like a networked game with like lots of different players in it, you would have information about where they are. They might be represented by their characters in space on the screen. They might be represented by sounds. Like if you're playing a game, you might hear somebody walking up behind you or something like that. So these are all different types of feedback that are communicating the state of the game to the player. Other information about the other actors in the world, like, you know, you might have different enemies with different difficulty levels. This is another state that would be communicated. So one term I'll talk about a lot is the idea of positive feedback. And this can be kind of a confusing term because positive feedback doesn't necessarily mean it's something that you want to happen, but it rather means something that teaches you how to play the game. So games provide positive feedback when they do something that shows you either this is good to do or this is bad to do, but it teaches you about how the game works. So, you know, if you're playing Mario and you fall off if you fall into a hole and you die, that's not good. That's not what you want to happen, but it is considered positive feedback because it teaches you can't fall into holes that will kill you. And so that teaches you something about the game system that makes it easier to play the game as when you reload and you try it again. So a good game system should have a lot of positive feedback. Every time something happens, it should say, this is something that you can do, or this is something that you can't do, or this is, dangerous for the character, or this is, a reward for the character. So all of those things kind of fall under this idea of positive feedback. So the opposite of positive feedback is negative feedback, or confusing or discouraging feedback. So for example, and we'll look at some examples of games that play with this concept that kind of blur the lines between positive and negative feedback a little bit. But if there's like a glitch in a game, for example, and your character, disappears behind a wall and you can't see them anymore for some reason, that would be obviously not positive feedback or negative feedback. Sometimes, however, we create confusing or discouraging feedback, not intentionally, but we have an idea for how we want a game to work, but it's not clear. So we really, as game designers, have to be very careful to make our intentions clear to the player so they understand if I died, it's for a specific reason, or if I lost points, it's for a specific reason. It's not just some glitch or some random confusing thing that happened in the game. So again, losing the game, we don't want to lose, but it is a form of positive feedback if it's clear why we lost, because it allows the player to develop their understanding of what's happening in the game world and the rules, and it makes them hopefully better at playing the game and more encouraged to continue playing the game because they understand, okay, I can't do that thing, so I have to try a different strategy. So hopefully the player will be excited to see what happens if they try a different strategy. Okay, we'll talk about game mechanics. I'm going to pause for a second and see if there's any questions so far. So we'll talk about game mechanics a little bit. What we were kind of just like discussing, game mechanics like kind of leads into game mechanics. Game mechanics is basically like the different rules of the game and how they fit together. So I'm sure most of you guys have heard this term before. It's probably not necessarily a new term, but again, we're defining our terms for the semester. So again, as I said, a system of rules that governs the way that the user is allowed to interact with the game. Game mechanics build up in a game to create a complex world. So you have a bunch of different game mechanics, and then the way that they fit together is how you create the system of the game, the setting, the genre, all of these different things. So the interface allows the user to make actions. So the interface can be, our physical interface, like the gamepad, but it can also be the interface on the game itself. I did share the screen. You might have to click. I think I'm sharing, right? You might have to click like watch stream on the box. You guys see that?
Yeah, I can see the stream.
Okay. If it's just like a little box, you can click on it and it'll make it bigger if you want to see it in like in full screen. But then you can turn on the grid view if you want to see everybody. Okay. So the game records the actions and makes decisions based on the input and then the environment. So still just talking about the feedback system. So we, hit whatever button we want to hit to walk or jump or throw something, and the game records that, and then it looks around what's going on in the game, and then it makes some choices like, are you allowed to jump here? How high can you jump? And then it changes the environment. It changes what you see to show you the result of that. So feedback is that form of changing game states and is given to the user. And then, of course, the user interprets the feedback, adjusts their approach, and that's how the game continues. So game dynamics are referred to, it sounds similar to game mechanics, but it's a little bit different. And it basically refers to the result of the mechanics over the course of the game. So game mechanics are the rules, and then game dynamics are how the rules play out over time. So, for example, in chess, to use a non-video game, although obviously there's video game versions of chess, in chess you have pretty specific rules. There's a certain way that you can move each one of your characters, and you have to trade back and forth turns. That's the game mechanics. I'm allowed to move my pawn 2 spaces, or I'm allowed to move my king 1 space. The game dynamics are how do those rules play out over time? So obviously in chess, the game takes a long time. There's a lot of different moves, but there's different, depending on the sort of knowledge or skill level of the player, there's a certain number of different types of chess games that might emerge from these rules. So game dynamics is our mechanics played out over time. So with good dynamics, the rules of the game are easy to learn. Okay, so not necessarily easy to master, like we're not going to become perfect players immediately, but the rules themselves should be pretty easy. We should be able to learn it in enough time that we're not like, oh my God, this is boring. I don't want to learn all these rules. It should take us enough time that it doesn't sort of like exceed our excitement level for the game. Sometimes I feel like that with new games, like even with the game I was just talking about, Deathloop, there's so many different things going on in the game that they have to explain to you. It takes like over an hour just to like get started. And for a lot of people, it's not really worth it, right? Like I could play, a bunch of rounds of another game in the same amount of time that I already know how to play. So the rules should be relatively easy to learn, but we should, take time to get better at them. The user is in direct control of the game avatar. This seems obvious, but you'll see this, sometimes this isn't kind of set up exactly correctly, where it should be really clear to the user like who they are in the game and what they can do. Players improve through gameplay, so this is pretty obvious. As we play the game, we get better at the mechanics. And the game gives immediate feedback. So that's a really important one. Sometimes it's really simple. If I hit the jump button, my character should jump, or if there's some reason why they can't jump, it should be really obvious to me why that is. But there's other aspects to that, like if I need to collect something in order to unlock a specific part of my level, there should be immediate feedback to tell me why I can't do that, what I have to do in order to do that. Sometimes part of the game is figuring out puzzles. And so it might not tell me exactly what I need to do, but it should point me in the direction of what I need to do. And it should do so immediately as soon as I get to that point of the game. And then sufficient feedback. So it should be enough for me to be able to figure it out on my own. If it's a puzzle, it's not, again, going to tell me the answer, but it should give me enough feedback of what I'm doing that I can figure out what it is I'm looking for in the puzzle. Another important one is recovery from mistakes. So different games deal with this in different ways. Usually in a game, if you have a player and you can die, you will have a number of lives. And so if you die, you'll see your lives go from like 3 to 2. And so you'll know, okay, I can make a mistake and continue playing the game, but I only have a certain number of mistakes. So in the game, you might be able to play the whole game from the very beginning without making a single mistake. And, if you're very extremely, skilled and intuitive, but most people can't do that. Most people are going to mess up or get a puzzle wrong or do something, that prevents them from getting to the end of the game. So we need to allow recovery from those mistakes along the way. Okay, so now we'll get into the 3 terms that you'll probably hear me talk about the most. They're pretty obvious, but they kind of define each component of a game. Everything that we put into the game is usually going to fit into one of these 3 components, except with the exception of like, scenery and trees and stuff like that. Although you could argue, that's a reward in some ways or a goal. But goals, obstacles, and rewards, these are our kind of main 3 components to a game. And part of creating the game mechanics is choosing what those goals and obstacles or rewards are. And then the game dynamics are how those play out over time. So here we have another rough drawing of Mario. And there's not very much happening in the scene, but we can actually see examples of all 3 of these things. We can see our goal, which is, the flag on the other side of the screen. And even though we can't see that when we get into the beginning of Mario, it's pretty obvious with Mario that you can only go in one direction when you start, right? You can only go to the right. So even though we don't see the goal, we have this implicit sort of example that that's where our goal is. It's getting to the other side of the level. That's reinforced by the obstacles and the rewards that we achieve as we go through the level. So obstacles are things like the little hole in the ground that we can fall through and die, as well as the Goomba character that will, if we get hit by them, we'll lose a life, or if we jump on their head, we will kill the character. So those are obstacles that prevent us from getting to the goal. And then finally, we have rewards, which are things that we get that either tell us, good job, you're going in the right direction, or they give us, something that helps us achieve our goal. So some rewards are just kind of pointing us in the right direction. Like if you get some points, or like in Sonic, all the rings, as you're collecting rings, it's showing you, this is the correct direction to be going. But some rewards, like in Mario, you can grow and become a bigger character, and so it gives you an extra life. You get the fireballs that you can shoot. Some of the rewards actually help you get past your obstacles. So in any game, we can define most of the components of the game into one of these three categories. Sometimes there's a little overlap, like you could say, oh, is this a goal or is it a reward? Maybe it's both. Sometimes obstacles and rewards might be part of the same thing, like you defeat an enemy and you get some reward for defeating the enemy. But usually we can kind of put everything in our game into one of these three categories. So most games have a very clear established goal. Like it's either to get to the end of the level, to beat your opponent, to find, like in Mario, you have to save the princess, very basic things like that. Some games have more mysterious goals that you have to find out, like exploring an abandoned island. I'm kind of referencing Myst in this case, which I don't know if it's kind of an old game. I assume that most people probably are not familiar with it, but it's a game. It's a really cool game. It probably doesn't, I don't know if it holds up, but it was, when I was like a kid, it was like one of my favorite games. And basically you're just like put on an abandoned island and you have to walk around and figure out what happened. And there's some puzzles and stuff like that. So sometimes the goal of the game is not so specific, but it's just to figure out what happened in this kind of story.
I've played that game before. I never finished it though.
Oh
Pretty good.
yeah. Yeah, it's actually a pretty hard game, and it's really old technology. Like they didn't have like really high resolution 3D graphics. So basically what they did is they shot movies of 3D graphics, and then you just like moving between these different movies. So it was like, it looks weird now, but when it came out, it was like, it was like really high end, cool graphics. So in a game, we use obstacles and rewards to lead the player towards the goal. So even though an obstacle is going to block us from the goal, it's also pointing us in the direction of the goal. So if you're playing a game and you see there's like a bunch of enemies that are hanging out around like a house or, a castle or something like that, even though the enemies are going to try to kill you, they're still telling you basically like, this is where you want to go. Your goal is probably in the thing that we're all, hanging out around. So even obstacles that prevent us from getting to our goal, they also lead us towards the goal. Rewards should lead us towards the goal. Everything should sort of lead us towards the goal of the game. And then they also provide challenges. So obstacles obviously provide challenges. They try to prevent us from getting to the goal. Rewards also kind of reinforce those challenges, because you might see, oh, if I go over, past this like really steep cliff or something like that, there's this like cool like weapon that I can get over there, something like that. So rewards will also kind of lead us towards challenges or lead us towards the goal. Okay, so complex games often have a variety of obstacles and rewards and multiple goals that are either sequenced or occurring contemporaneously. These elements will add up to create a complex game with multiple possibilities. So a way, you guys would probably have a natural sense of how this works. You start a game, there's a couple enemies, you can only do a couple things, and you kind of figure out, okay, I can jump, I can shoot fireballs, I can do these things. Then you go to the next level, there's some more stuff in there, and then in the third level, they combine all those things. So you start off introducing each element, and then what that leads to is more complex, different combinations of those elements. So goals can be objectives for the player to progress through the game or win the game. Many games have one goal and a bunch of like side goals, like side missions is a possibility. Goals can be compounded to create a complex series of events. So a lot of games that have more of a narrative structure, like an RPG, they might give you a whole bunch of goals that you have to do before you can get to the main goal. Sometimes those side goals are unrelated, like they don't necessarily have to be sometimes you can have a side mission that you don't actually have to finish to beat the game, but it will still be there for entertainment or for a special reward or something like that, some other value. For obstacles, these are also challenges, puzzles, enemies, all of these different things that prevent you from getting to the end of the game or to the goal of the game are obstacles. And as I mentioned, challenges are going to lead us towards the goal. Obstacles tend to be related to the game genre. And that's one way that we know what type of game we're playing is what are the obstacles. So if the obstacles are jumping between platforms, we're probably playing a platformer. If the obstacles are solving puzzles, then we're playing a puzzle game. So everything is related to the genre, and we'll talk more about that in a couple weeks. But typically, obstacles are going to tell us what type of genre we're playing. So right, in a puzzle-based game, you'll solve math or logic puzzles. In an arcade game, you would have enemies or barriers or other physical things. Some games, the obstacles might be more abstract, like a mystery, searching for an item, searching for a character, decoding a story, learning the history of something. For rewards, there's lots of different types of rewards. So they could be currency, like getting coins in Mario, getting different types of currency that you can spend to get other objects in more like resource management type games. Sometimes there are objects like things that you can actually use in the game or different characters that you can add to the characters that you can play. Sometimes they're purely just visual. Sometimes a reward is just getting like a cool outfit or a cool hat or whatever to put on your character. So sometimes a reward may not actually help you win the game, but it's just fun. It's something that you just enjoy visually. Rewards also should reinforce like that you're doing well, that you're playing the game correctly. If you're getting lots of points, that should show you that you're doing things, that you're going in the right direction. Rewards typically affect the gameplay, such as enhancing aspects of the player or revealing new parts of the game. Some rewards, as I mentioned, may be purely aesthetic or non-functional, like new graphics for the character. Okay, so those are our terms. There's a few links here. These are not required readings, but these are links to articles that I think are good to kind of pair with what we're talking about. I'm going to click on a couple of them just to show you guys what's in them really quickly. Any questions before I do that? Okay. Okay, so the positive feedback. This is from gamedeveloper.com. There's a bunch of different websites that have good tutorials about game design. Ernest Adams is a good sort of game designer and writer about game design, and he's talking about positive feedback. And the thing I like about this article are these sort of charts of basically game dynamics. And so this is a good way of looking at how games progress over time and talking about like the balance of the game. So here's the example of a foot race, and it says no positive feedback. So essentially in a foot race, you have two people, A and B, and they just run in a direction, and presumably one of them is going to be faster, and they're just going to keep pulling ahead until they, win 100% of the race. And, usually there's no back and forth, right? Like if somebody's faster, they're probably just faster. So that's a game, or that's a game with no positive feedback. There's no back and forth. So an unbalanced game, or an unfair game. So assuming that A and B have the same level of skill, in an unbalanced game, A will win, but then B will win a little bit, but then A will win a little bit more, B wins a little bit more, and then A ultimately wins. And what's significant here is that the player who's winning never crosses this line in the middle, this threshold. So A is winning the whole time. So it's not very exciting. There's a little bit of up and down movement, but there's no point of this game where we think that B might win. And if you're playing against the computer, you can think of B as the computer. So if this is a game and you're A and B is the computer, and there's no point at which you think I'm going to lose this game, it's not a very good balanced game because there's no real challenge to it. So then we have a two balanced game. Okay, so A and B. So it's just going back and forth, and neither player or the player versus the computer is actually making any progress or pulling ahead. It's just toggling back and forth forever. So then we have a balanced game. So the B player starts to win, the A player starts to win, it swings back to B, but then it switches and goes all the way to A. So this is more balanced, but it's not very long. So we want a little bit more back and forth. And then we have the ideal game progression according to this author. There's a lot of back and forth, and there's these big swings. So A starts out okay, but then B's winning by a lot, then A is winning, and then the swings are kind of getting bigger and bigger. We're going back and forth, but eventually either the player or the computer or whoever is going to win in the end. So yeah, I think that's kind of a good example of game dynamics. This is an article about interaction design, but it's talking about it through the lens of video games. And I think this is something that's interesting to read in terms of thinking about basically onboarding players into the game, which is something that interaction designers have to think about. How do we get people to interact with our product or our website or our software in a way that they're kind of encouraged to learn the tools and they understand everything that's going on. And they have this kind of like interesting model of basically like feedback loop and rewards. So it's kind of interesting talking about basically gamifying design using some different game design concepts. Oh, this one. So this original article is missing this graphic that I really like. This is a more elaborate version of my graphic of our feedback system within the game. This article also has a bunch of other interesting stuff that we didn't really touch on today. I think it's a good article talking about how games are kind of put together, the different parts of the game that fit together to make our game mechanics. This is an interesting article talking about accessibility. And it's interesting to kind of consider the different sort of affordances we have to think about when we're designing a game for different people with different accommodations and different levels of accessibility. And it's a cool thing. We don't always think about this, but it will help you think about other aspects of game design. Like if I have to think about who my player is. It's very different than other media. Like if we're making a movie, we're just kind of telling the story. We don't have to really consider whether people can watch the movie or not. People are either just going to sit and watch the movie or they're not. But with a game, for the game to work, the people have to be able to play it. So this is kind of an interesting thing, just reflecting on, another level of like how usable is the game? How do people interact with the game? What kind of assumptions can I make about the player and where that might, make my game not work? So this is kind of a longer article, but I think it's worth reading. So it's pretty interesting. But yeah, so those are some different resources that I recommend checking out. Again, not required readings, just things that I think you might find interesting. Okay. So that's everything for our intro. lecture. I'm gonna stop the recording real quick, and then I'll take questions if there are any.